So you have to unmute yourself, Professor Krishna.
Yeah.
Let me mute all and then unself, sir.
Yeah.
Okay.
Welcome, Casimir.
And yes. All right.
Dr. Krishna is muted.
No, I have unmuted myself. I said greetings to all of you before we start on serious matters. So this weekend, we will try to do chapters 4, 5, and 6. In chapter 4, Krishna talks about self-knowledge and explains what self-knowledge means. We already said last week that self-knowledge is not knowledge about the self. It is a quest for what is true and what is false. Through that quest, one hopes to end the illusions in one's mind and thereby have greater clarity. So it's a learning process. It is time-consuming process. And it's an endless process. It has no end in view. If you do it with an end in view, you bring in the personality and the ego into this quest. And then if this quest itself is egoistic, one cannot come to freedom from the ego. Just as through violence, you cannot attain peace or non-violence. Now, last time, Krishnaji explained that there is an intimate connection between the state of our consciousness and the state of society. That if there is disorder in our consciousness, it projects into our relationships, and millions of such relationships constitute society. So if we really want a lasting change in society, one must work for the transformation of consciousness. You can't transform the consciousness of another, but you can transform your own consciousness through this process of self-knowledge. There are these two quests for truth. The scientific quest, which is to understand the truth about how nature functions, how the external world around us functions. And this religious quest, which is a quest for understanding how our consciousness functions and how all the negative emotions come into our consciousness. Now, in both quests, one has to eliminate the illusions. For a long time in the scientific quest, people believed that the earth is flat. But when they did experiments, they doubted that. they came upon the fact that it is not flat, it is really approximately spherical with a very large radius so that any small part of it appears flat. And similarly, people believed for thousands of years that the earth is the center of the universe and everything else moves around it. That was an illusion. But they believed in it because that's how the appearance was. Only when people did elaborate experiments and doubted this conclusion, they came to the realization that it really appears like that because the earth is rotating around its axis and not because the whole world is rotating around the center of the earth. So the scientific development also has been the ending of illusions in the mind, and it brings about a radical change in the view, our view of the world, the external world. Something similar is true about the inner world of our consciousness. If there are a lot of illusions with which we are living, which means not facts, which are part of nature, but simply human constructs of human thought, which have been accepted by you axiomatically, and which are not true or which produce a lot of disorder in relationships. So those are illusions. Let us understand for ourselves what some of these illusions are and what havoc they play in our life. How do they produce disorder in our consciousness and therefore in our relationships? At the very superficial level, there are what we call superstitions. They produce fear, although they are false. Those who believe in them experience a lot of fear. For instance, in India, if you are going someplace and a cat crosses the road, there is an ancient belief that it's a bad omen. And when you grow up with this belief from childhood, it creates fear when a cat crosses the road. I have had scientist colleagues of mine who have turned their car and gone by a different route just because a cat crossed the road. There are more other sinister superstitions. There are people who believe that disease comes because God is angry with you. And that's very risky because when their child falls ill, instead of taking him to a doctor, they go and pray in a temple or a mosque, hoping that God will cure him. That can be extremely dangerous. So fear is brought about through these such illusions. I will not illustrate more because it's very easy to understand and you can yourself multiply the examples of such illusions. In the Christian world, there has been for a long time the belief that the number 13 is a bad omen. And it created fear in the minds of people. If they were allotted room number 13 or seat number 13 in a journey. Then, at a deeper level in the consciousness, as part of our conditioning, there are cultural illusions. We grow up with them because we grow up in a particular culture, a particular family, and we imbibe these from our environment. So there is the Christian belief and there is the Hindu belief, and there is the Muslim belief in God, and how to worship God, and so on. And if you believe in that and you are attached to that, then it divides you from others and creates division, which manifests sometimes as hatred and sometimes even into wars and killings. We have had more wars in the name of religion than even in the name of property or territory. So, but cultural illusions are not only religious belief. There are also social and ideological beliefs. So there is the division between the communist and the capitalist. Their ideas are different, but their consciousness is not different. So again, this kind of ideological identification with a particular group creates division from the rest of the world, isolates oneself into one fragment of humanity. Krishnaji explains that whole process and says, and asks the question, can you live without any identification, without any belief in any religion? Then you can be creative. You will not interpret everything that you observe in terms of your belief and your conditioning. So the belief or the conditioning colors your thinking and your perception. So he says, without self-knowledge, you have no basis for thought. Your thought itself is colored. It is from a particular point of view. It's not universal thinking. So that's why he insists that you need to free yourself of your conditioning, which is an accident of birth. But that requires a lot of inquiry because we are not even aware of all the illusions that are in our mind. This is a difficulty because the man whose mind is in illusion is not aware that he is in illusion. He takes it to be true. If he knows that it's an illusion, it ceases to be an illusion. For example, fairy tales are illusory, but we know that they are illusory. They are not factual. Therefore, they don't create any disorder. But things like casteism in India or the notion that you must outsmart everybody else and rise to the top of your subject or your class or your work creates rivalry, creates competition, goes contrary to brotherhood between human beings. Because you look upon the other man as a rival, not as a brother. So these illusions have sinister consequences in our life. And that is why it's important to go through this inquiry of self-knowledge, wherever it might take you. There is no fixed destination. It's not meant to come upon enlightenment. That's an imaginary state. We don't know what it is. And to make that into a destination, converts this whole process into a desire or ambition process and sustains the ego. There is no ego anywhere in the world except in human consciousness, neither in the animals, nor in the trees, nor in the universe. but only it is the creation of our own thought and our own approach to life. If you approach life not egoistically, not looking all the time for some personal gain, personal advantage, personal fulfillment, then there is no ego. And Krishna says, love is where the self is not. When your motivation is not one of self-interest, then you are acting out of love. That's his definition of love. Not what we call love in society, which is either desire or possessiveness or attraction or sexuality and so on. So there are a lot of illusions in our mind. Cultural illusions are innumerable, and unless you question them and inquire deeply into the consequences of living with those illusions, they won't drop away. Not because Krishnaji has said so, or you have read in a book that, or you have heard me say this. That doesn't bring about the change. It has to be your own perception so that you perceive the danger of living with that illusion. Then it drops away. It's not your will to drop it away that drops it away. Nature has put an intelligence into our consciousness as well as our body, which does not permit you to embrace danger. But when you are not aware of the danger, you embrace it. So all temptation is like that. It is born out of ignorance. Ignorance of what the danger is in that activity or in that belief. And it can be overcome through this quest for truth. But for that, you have to not assume that whatever you think is true. That's what creates the illusion. So begin from not knowing and inquire. In science also, this is encouraged. We are told, don't accept anything because the book says it. Don't accept it because some authority has said. Test it. Do an experiment. Find out if it is true. And in doing that experiment and discovering whether it is true, your understanding goes deeper. It's that same process Krishnaji is advocating, only here there is not that kind of method as there is in science of measuring and making prophecies and then comparing the prophecy with the actuality of what the experimental results are, and then deciding whether it is true or not. That process is valid because the ultimate truth, even the religious truth, is not irrational. So if you can find contradiction, then you can know that it is not true. But you cannot know what is true. To know what is true, you have to have a direct perception, which is what Krishnamurti calls an insight. And that's only possible when you are free from your conditioning. Otherwise, your conditioning will interpret that insight in terms of its own past and beliefs. So that's why freedom is an absolute necessity. And the extent to which you have freed your mind of illusions, to that extent, there is clarity in your thinking. It's still not enlightenment. It's not that all illusions have ended, but you begin this process of self-knowledge, this learning which we call self-knowledge, and you come upon greater and greater clarity. If you can end one illusion, potentially you can end all illusion. But unfortunately, we seem to only want to end those illusions which create some discomfort. As soon as the discomfort is gone, we are not interested in this quest for truth. And Krishna says, no, don't decide on the basis of comfort and discomfort. Persevere, stay with the question till you have a deeper perception of the truth. And you will know that because it will transform your consciousness. It will transform the way you relate with people, with animals, with nature, with your wife, with your servant, with property, everything. All relationships will be affected by that. And if there is still disorder in your consciousness in the form of negative emotions, violence, conflict, jealousy, and so on, it's telling you that you have not come upon clarity in your mind. So that's the galvanometer. Just as in science, through a galvanometer, we detect whether a current is flowing or not. Through honest observation of your consciousness, you can detect whether there is disorder in the consciousness or not. It's only when your consciousness is freed of disorder that there is complete clarity. There is a silent mind, because the chattering of the mind goes away. And then you can pay attention, much greater attention, because there is not the distraction of the chattering mind. So the chattering mind provides escapes away from the truth. And it's important to come upon this silent mind, which means thought ceases to be compulsive. Thought is not your master driving you. You are the master of thought. You can use thought where it is necessary and leave it alone when it is risky. That's what we do. When you have a tool like a screwdriver, you use it when you need to use it, and the rest of the time you keep it in the toolbox. You don't get addicted to it. But unfortunately, we identify with our thoughts, create this thing called the ego, the me, and then the whole of our life gets hijacked towards working for the me and the mind. My property, my religion, my country, my family, and so on. So you identify with a fragment of humanity, and your mind is constantly working like a lawyer, defending the me and the mind. Then you are not really in quest of truth. You are in quest of profit, of advantage, of support, of security for the me and the mind, and so on. So that's why Krishna says the ego is corruption. Corruption means you are taking undue advantage for yourself in all relationships. You're putting the first person singular as the most important person to be worked for. And that's not true. That's a false approach. And from that approach, the egoistic approach, all the negative emotions arise. That's why it is important to learn about this whole process, not just object to it, form an opinion that ego is a bad thing and we should do away with it. You will not be able to do away with it. Your will does not work in these matters. But if you have a deep perception of the danger, your approach will change. And the ego comes in only in the approach. One simple example, easy to understand, is that of playing a game of tennis or whatever, football. If you approach it egoistically, you're hung upon victory. You want the reward for yourself. You want the praise for yourself, and therefore you're hung upon victory. Then it becomes a desire process, an ego process, an ambitious process. And all the consequences of the ego will be there. If it is obstructed, you will get angry. You will feel frustrated. All the negative emotions will come into. If your opponent falls down, you will feel happy that you will now win. So all kinds of negative emotions come when you approach it egoistically. But supposing you don't approach it that way, there is also the joy of just engaging in that activity, in that game, and playing for excellence. And your friend wins, or the opposite team wins. What's wrong with that? They played better than your team, and therefore they won. Why should one feel unhappy about that? If the right thing happened, why do we feel unhappy? These are the questions of everyday life that one has to grapple with. Otherwise, this comparison, competition, this rivalry never leaves you. It is there with you in your office, in your family, with your brother, and so on. So the ego creates a lot of division between human beings and destroys love and destroys brotherhood. That is why Krishna says there is love when the self is not. When you're not, motivation is not one of self-interest, then the relationship is one of love. So find out whether you can approach everything in life not egoistically, but with love. That means the concern is there, the feelings are there, but the motive of benefiting from all that for yourself is not there. That's not the motive for the action. And similarly, in self-knowledge, you shouldn't have a motive for an achievement. Otherwise, it becomes an ambition process. And the problem is not with the aim of desire or the aim of ambition. That's what religion said. Religion said that have noble desires, don't have ignoble desires. And Krishnaji is saying no. Desire itself is a problem. Approaching life with desire itself is a problem, irrespective of whether it's a noble desire or an ignoble desire. That's a conditioning, that's an opinion. What is noble, what is not noble, what is good, what is bad, and so on. So free yourself of the conditioning, look upon life and learn, look at it from the point of view of cause and effect. That's the learning mind. The learning mind is looking at it from the point of view of cause and effect to discover the truth of the causation, and not as good and bad, as noble and ignoble, and so on, not based on an opinion. That's only possible when you are free from your conditioning. Otherwise, the conditioning creates these measures and you keep judging. So he says this quest is to observe yourself without judgment, without justification, without comparison, with the intention of learning about the causation of what is taking place, exactly as it is in science. But in science, there is that scientific method you can rely on. There is no method here, no system. That's why it is a pathless land, because if you have a definite path, then it is a system. There is no system. So one has to come upon a creative perception. And all great human beings whom we respect highly have been people who have come out of their past conditioning and brought something new into the world. The Buddha grew up as a Hindu, gave up Hinduism, discovered something, and came upon the truth beyond the known. He freed himself of his past. Jesus Christ also grew up as a Jew, where the belief was an eye for an eye and a tooth for the tooth. How did he come upon the realization that this is false? That hatred will only beget more hatred, that you must show your other cheek also. Even if the opponent is violent, you must not be violent. So can your virtue be independent of the state of the other human being who may be opposing you or criticizing? Then deeper still are the psychological illusions like hurts and the memory of what happened in the past. Not the factual memory, but the psychological memory of the pleasure or the pain that it gave you. All that also colors your perception. And it's held deeper. That's what the psychologists call complexes. So those are also illusions in the mind. And finally, at the deepest level, the sages have said that the ego itself is an illusion. The feeling of being a separate individual is itself an illusion, which arises from identifying with your own opinions, with one fragment of humanity, or with your own opinion and ideology and so on. So it's your own creation. It's not the creation of nature. The child is not born with that. He acquires that as he grows up. And on another occasion, we should study that. How does a child acquire the ego or the egoistic approach as he grows up? We'll take that up in another chapter, another time, which talks about the self or the ego, the origin. That's connected with our approach in education. Because education, if you know the danger of the ego, education must not promote the ego in the child. At present, we are promoting competition. We are promoting reward and punishment, all of which creates or enhances the ego process in the child. So we are really damaging the child, but we think we are doing him good because he learns a little mathematics or a little literature better. And that's our aim. The aim is not holistic. We are not concerned about the whole of the life of that child. We are only concerned with his achievement in your subject. And that kind of narrow thinking, you use all this promotion of the ego to make him do what you want him to do, which itself is violence. Now, you may never come to the deep realization of how the ego forms. It's relatively easy to free yourself of superstitions and of cultural illusions. More difficult to free yourself of psychological complexes. And still more difficult to come upon total freedom from the ego. But you have to begin with this process of self-knowledge, which is this quest for what is true and what is false. I find it akin to the scientific quest, because in the scientific quest also you don't undertake that quest in order to become a Nobel laureate or become Einstein and so on. You do that in order to understand how nature functions. And to the extent to which you understand, to that extent, your worldview changes. I think it's something similar here, that to the extent to which you have ended illusions through this learning, which we call self-knowledge, which is not really knowledge about the self at all. It is this learning of what is true and what is false, and the ending of the illusions or the ending of the false, which brings about transformation of consciousness, and therefore a regeneration, a new something in your relationships. All your relationships will undergo a change. The negative emotions will go down. The change is a byproduct of understanding, which is wisdom. So that's why Krishna says self-knowledge is the key to wisdom. But it's a process. It's not something that happens in a second. Perception is not a process. When perception takes place, that is instantaneous. But there is not only one truth to be perceived. For every illusion, there is a truth to be perceived to end that illusion. So, begin with this quest for truth. For the sake of learning about yourself, wherever that takes you. That's how I understand him. Because if you have a destination in mind, you turn this process itself into an ego process. And all the consequences of the ego will follow. That's a folly. That self is a born of illusion. So, friends, I'll end this here and we can have discussion. And I'll take up the next two chapters tomorrow morning. They deal with action based on idea and belief relating to desire, the relationship between belief and desire. We'll look at that tomorrow. But today our topic was self-knowledge, and that's what I have gone into. But the examples I have taken are from my own understanding, my own investigations. They are not from Krishnamurti. So take them with a pinch of salt. Don't accept anything. You find out, you inquire, you learn. You are the teacher and you are the taught. Nobody else can give you this truth. That's what Krishnamurti has said. You don't have to accept it. Find out. If you think you can get the truth from somebody or from some book, try it. Try it experimentally and see whether it brings order into your consciousness. That's all, friends. There is no authority. It's a learning process. It's a process of a quest for truth. Truth which we don't know what it is. Posit the truth as the unknown and search for it without ambition. And that's why he says, don't use thought, because thought is born of your conditioning. It's from a particular point of view. Do it with awareness and passive awareness at that, not wanting to change anything, just watching. There is an interesting verse in one of the Upanishads, I think the Mundakya Upanishad, which says the human consciousness is like two birds sitting on a tree. One bird is nibbling at the fruit and tasting the sweetness or sourness or bitterness of it. The other bird is only watching what this bird is doing. And the human consciousness is both these birds in one. That means there is the ego part of our consciousness, and there is the other part of our consciousness, which is just the capacity to be aware, to watch what is going on, without judging, without thinking about, without measuring. And the wisdom comes from the second bird. So keep the second bird alive. Don't object to the first bird. The first bird is very much there. But you can learn about the first bird through the second bird, which means you can learn about yourself through being objectively, passively aware. And awareness is not a thought faculty. It is something nature has endowed consciousness with it. The moment your child is conscious, he begins to be aware. Thinking process develops later on. So awareness is not thought. Sometimes we talk about it in that way. Are you aware of what the capital of such and such a country is? Then you are just asking about some knowledge, whether you're having that knowledge or not. That's not the awareness that Krishnaji is talking about. This awareness is this capacity to see without thought, without measurement, without justification, without division between good and bad, black and red, and so on. No chattering of the mind, just watching. And that's how science is also done. So I see parallels between the two quests, except that there is a method and there is mathematics to be used for logic. Here you don't have those aids. You have to simply go with your own capacity. Thank you. I'll end it here and we can have some discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor.
Welcome.
Now we can go into the question and answer portion of our meeting. The first questioner has posed several questions, and I will read them one or two at a time, so that there are not too many at a time.
I prefer one at a time because I find it difficult to remember a number of them simultaneously.
Yes, exactly. So these questions are from Urmi. The first one is, how can one observe oneself when the self or the center is never static?
You are watching whatever is going on, which includes this self process. Don't say, I must watch without the self. You won't be able to. Watch whatever actually takes place and be aware of the contribution of the self. See, thought doesn't really obstruct awareness. One can be aware of one's thought, the origin of that thought, the feelings associated with that thought. The whole thing can be observed, provided you are not on a mission to end it or change it or interfere with it. Then you can watch like a phenomenon. How does a scientist watch a fish and find out how it lives? Just watches. He watches how it is born, how it lays eggs, how it swims, what it eats, and so on, and documents it. If he says stupid fish, it should not do this, it should do that, and so on. He is not a scientist. So can you watch yourself like a scientist watching a phenomenon without interfering with that phenomenon? That's how I understand Krishnaji to be asking us to watch ourselves with passive awareness. Otherwise, you are yourself distorting what you are watching. We said the other day that just as a scientist has to make his lenses of his microscope achromatic and free from aberration, in the same way, we need to make our mind free from aberration in order to perceive the truth. So, if you bring in your conditioning, your thinking, your opinions, your judgments, and so on, they are already distorting your observation. And so that's a danger. So is it possible to watch without doing that? Try it. Don't just discuss it. Try it in your life. After all, we do that in science. But it's easier there because your own desires are not mixed up with what you're observing. But here, you're observing yourself and very difficult to be objective, but not impossible. If you are aware of the subjective, the danger of the subjective, you won't go that way. But otherwise, it becomes subjective. And then you are not perceiving the truth and you're not listening to what is happening. You are listening to your own chattering of your own mind. So that's the difficulty of this quest, but if you are interested in it, you have to try it. You know, it is difficult only because we have not persevered and done much with it. Mathematics also is extremely difficult for someone who doesn't understand it. But we work for 20 years to learn it. And then your mind functions rapidly and understands what that mathematics is doing on. It's something similar. We have not really learned this inquiry in the way Krishnamurti is pointing out. So naturally, it will appear very difficult. But if you attempt it and persevere with it, there is nothing very difficult about it. So Krishna says, life is very complex because our consciousness is complex. Society is complex. And we grow up in that society, and what is outside going on comes into your consciousness and creates the content. And then that content maintains the society in the same form. So what is outer becomes the inner, and what is inner creates the outer. So it's really one process. And unless you can get out of this vicious circle, you remain trapped in your conditioning, in what may be called the tradition of your past, which means all the problems persist. And that's the reason that there is such tremendous inertia in every society. Our problems keep repeating themselves because we are not creative.
Yeah, thank you. So now I will read the next question. Can there be thinking or understanding without words?
There is when there is love. You know what your friend or your colleague is feeling. When there is empathy, you understand him instantly. It doesn't require analysis and thought and so on. But we are so addicted to thinking, measuring, judging, justifying, and so on. That process prevents that, which is the same thing as saying the ego destroys love.
And the following question is, can there be direct perception of the senses without the interference of thought?
We have to play with it, find out. Krishnaji has even suggested looking at a tree without naming it, because the naming brings in all the associations with that name, which is from your knowledge and your past. So find out, sit down in front of a tree and see if you can look at it without bringing in all your knowledge about the tree and whatever, including the scientific knowledge. Not just discuss it theoretically as we are doing now, but actually sit down and do it and see, and you will discover the difficulty of it. So it's a very practical learning. You have to actually get hands-on, do it in your life, not just talk about it, discuss it, and come to a conclusion and say, I like this, that is good, that is not good, etc. That is very superficial. That's just forming opinions. Opinions are not facts. And there is no perception in an opinion. So this whole game of self-knowledge is not a game of opinions. Opinions don't transform consciousness. Putin's opinions are different from Zelensky's opinion, but his consciousness is functioning the same way as Zelensky's consciousness.
And the next question is, what is conscious, unconscious, and subconscious mind? Is this division real?
It's a way of describing what lies deeper in our consciousness and what lies at a more superficial level. I pointed out that superstitions lie at the conscious level of the mind. They go away even with studying science and reasoning and so on. Cultural division lies deeper. Some of it may be even subconscious. You will have to actually watch it in order to find out that. And still deeper are the psychological complexes. They certainly lie in the subconscious. But Krishnaji says in the book, Wholeness of Life, those who are more interested in this should read that book, Wholeness of Life. There are dialogues with David Bohm and some other scientists and so on. There he says that once you have understood the conscious mind, thought becomes silent. Then the subconscious enters into consciousness. It can also be watched, and you can free yourself of what is in the subconscious. When that happens, the collective subconscious of humanity enters into the consciousness. That has also to be watched, and you have to go beyond it. So, there is no end to this process. It begins with the conscious mind, then goes deeper into the unconscious psychological mind, and then still deeper into the collective subconscious of humanity and so on. That requires great passion for this learning. We want to do this learning like all other learning to quickly get some results. Sorry, it is not like that. It has very little significance to do this only casually.
And the last question from the series is, how can a person having self-knowledge live in this divisive world as an outsider and yet perform his mundane duties to perfection?
Read the biography of Krishnamurti. He was brought up in the Theosophical Society, deeply conditioned into Theosophy. How did he come out of that conditioning? How did he lead his life without any property, without any fear, and so on? He has given us an example. So it's not an imaginary thing. If he can do it, any human being can do it. But you have to persevere with it. We give up. We say it's impossible. If you say it's impossible, it becomes impossible. You make it impossible by saying it is impossible. Because when you feel something is impossible, your energy won't flow in that direction. So not to say that to yourself and say, I don't know, I'm going to try and find out. Then you have the energy to find out. But when you are only interested in achievement of some result, then the mind says, this is possible, this is impossible. It says, I don't have the capacity, and so on. He says, it's not a matter of capacity. But passion is required. Without passion, this inquiry has very little significance. Passion to learn about the truth and to end the illusions in the mind, to free oneself of one's past.
And the next question comes from Kanan. Could the ego be an outcome of evolution, and does it serve a purpose at all?
We'll go into it in detail. There is a whole chapter about the self. But briefly, I'll mention there is no ego in the universe anywhere. It is something that is created by human thought. The human thought is born from one's conditioning. And the conditioning results after birth, the way we are brought up, the environment in which we grow up, we just imbibe from the environment. The ego just requires three things which are there in every human being. One is the instinct of seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. The other is the capacity for memory, remembrance. And the third is the capacity for imagination. These three things create the ego process. It happens in every child. Must have happened in Krishnamurti also. But you can learn about it. The capacity of awareness is the intrinsic capacity of consciousness, and we have not used it. We have used thought. And thought is the outcome of conditioning. So we have really not come out of conditioning. We are living with our conditioning and creating the mess, and at the same time arguing against the mess. You have to come out of that and use awareness and watching in order to learn about yourself. That's what he is asking us to do. Not saying this is easy or difficult. That is the truth. Truth is neither easy nor difficult, neither good nor bad. I mean, the earth attracts a stone. Is that good or bad? That's the truth about nature, the way it functions. So in the same way, the truth is the truth. You can't say it's difficult, it is easy, and so on. That's what it is. If you are interested in learning about it, discovering it, go ahead. This is the way to come upon the truth. It requires creativity. You can't demand creativity of a person or of yourself. You can be aware of what all blocks creativity and try to eliminate that. Attachment to knowledge, attachment to opinions blocks creativity. We said that. Socrates, Buddha, Jesus Christ, Krishnamurti, they walked out of their past and came upon something new. Why can't we? If you are slave to the past, you can't. That's the truth. Don't say it is difficult. That's how it is. Nobody promised that life would be easy. It's not easy to be human. Much more easy to be a dog, because everything is determined for you by nature. A human being is given choices, and we have messed it up with those choices. That's why we need self-knowledge. The dog doesn't need self-knowledge, nor the tiger, nor snake, none of them, don't need self-knowledge. We need self-knowledge because we can be destructive and we can also be constructive. So we have to learn what is the right use of thought and what's the wrong use of thought. What is the right use of imagination? What's the wrong use of imagination? Not right and wrong in some religious sense, based on some belief, but by seeing the consequences. It is wrong if it produces misery, if it produces ill health, and so on, it's wrong. And it is right if it is healthy, if it is creating happiness, welfare, it's right. You have to watch that, the consequences of your approach, and learn whether that approach is right or wrong in this sense.
We have a couple of questions from Dakshina. What is the role of virtue in self-knowledge?
Virtue is order in consciousness. Religions defined virtue in terms of certain actions as being virtuous and certain other actions as being vice, and said you must practice virtue and you must avoid vice. Human beings have tried that for centuries, and you can see the result of it. So Krishnamurti says you can't practice virtue. Virtue is a state of consciousness. It's not your decision to do certain actions or not do certain actions. That's a trivial definition of virtue. So come upon, he says, come upon love. That means freedom from the self. And then do what you will, it will be right. So that's a religious definition of right and wrong. Is that action which is born of the self is wrong action even if it succeeds. And that action which is born out of love and compassion is right action even if it fails. It is not dependent on whether it succeeds or it fails. The Gita said the same thing, but people don't understand it that way. It said, your concern is with action, not with the fruits of the action.
Now I will read the second question preceded by repeating the first question because the second refers to it. So the first question that we just discussed was, what is the role of virtue in self-knowledge? And the second question is, does it not result in becoming from a state of psychological disorder to order?
Yes, if you are able to end illusions in your mind, you will have order in consciousness. To what extent, one cannot say. It's up to each person. If you learn mathematics and physics, you will understand the world. To what extent, one cannot say. You have your own limits, and somebody else may go beyond those limits, and so on. So, start learning and then be in the quest of truth. Don't have a destination. Wherever that takes you, that's your destiny. But if you don't do this quest, you will remain with the present state of your being. If you are satisfied with it, continue. Nobody is saying you must do this, and you don't have to do this because Krishnamurti is saying it. Do it if you feel interested in it. It doesn't take separately time to do this. You can be doing whatever you are doing, and the second bird can be watching what the first bird is doing and learning from that watching. It just requires a shift in your aim. Instead of wanting to become or achieve, you are wanting to learn. The desire to learn is not egoistic. The desire to become is egoistic. It's very subtle. Your motive determines whether it's egoistic or not.
And the last question from the series is, how is virtue connected with freedom?
By freedom, if you understand freedom from conditioning, then that's a prerequisite for virtue, because then you are able to free yourself of the illusions and therefore end the disorder in consciousness. When you end the disorder in consciousness, there is order, and that order is virtue. Socrates said the same thing. If you read him, he said there is only one virtue, and that is order in consciousness. But you have to understand what is order. We think order is discipline, military discipline. Military is very ordered. No, military is disorder. They fear. So they are not looking at the psyche. They are only seeing the external performance and calling it order. So there is a lot of misunderstanding about all this.
Next, we have a question from Gayatri. Worship of success is egocentricity, and so is becoming. Kay used to guide, saying, don't become. But in a world that worships success and endless process of becoming, how should one free oneself of these demands of the society and lead a free and peaceful life?
Society doesn't demand that. Your family may demand that. Your relationships may demand that. You have to be able to be independent of these demands from others and lead your life according to what you feel is right. So if you are dependent on society and you want their goodwill and so on, you will begin to conform to what society says. And then that's exactly what tradition is. And that's why there is such a inertia in society. Our problems just continue. I mean, the Hindu-Muslim division has just continued for centuries. Wars have continued for thousands of years. It's the same process, repeating again and again and again. Because the same kind of thinking will create the same problem again and again. And what we call solution is simply some sort of compromise, temporary compromise. That's not a solution. It's a solution only when the causation is ended, causation of that war or causation of the conflict is ended. That's possible only when there is transformation of consciousness. But we think that this is impractical. So we want to do what is practical. And all the time we have been doing what is practical and we have ended up where we are. So is it really practical, the way we are living, all these wars, all this killing, is it really practical? It's the result of the way we are approaching life, all of us. All of us are contributing to these problems of the world. We blame few people who are our leaders and so on, but who made them leaders? They are born out of us. They're not really different from us. The poor man not very different from the rich man. Circumstances are different. Consciousness is just the same. There is greed, there is jealousy, there is ambition, all that. But externally, they appear very different.
Now we have a question from Sam. Professor, you mentioned the process of self-knowledge and that perception is instantaneous. Then what does it take to keep this process in time wholesome, devoid of delusions, and where does this immense energy come from?
Energy is there in every human being. It gets activated by his desire. You may be feeling lazy, but if a tiger enters the room, you will discover how much energy you have. So that laziness is just born out of the fact that the self-interest is not driving you. If we are driven by self-interest, then that's the ego process. So you have to discover whether there is an energy which is not derived from the ego. That is the energy of love and compassion. But you know, our education does not even introduce these questions to us. I did my PhD, nobody ever asked these questions. We just accept what society says is love, what society calls respect. We accept the hierarchy and so on, that you must respect your teacher and your senior, but you don't have to respect your child and so on. So lots of these wrong values are built into us and we don't know that they are wrong values. So this quest for truth is a search for the right values of life. And we don't know what those right values are. We are merely repeating what we have been told. And that's a dangerous state to be in. That's an uncreative state. It's conformity. So society doesn't change. Everything goes on the same way. This is the truth, not that it's not easy, it's difficult. Yes, it is difficult. Nobody promised that life would be easy. You didn't ask for that promise before you were born. So it is what it is. Find out if it is true or not. If it's not true, do what you want to. That's what people are doing anyway. And that's what has created the havoc in society. Each person doing what he thinks is in his self-interest. You have created a society like that.
Now we have a question from Kapil. Can thought be used as a tool for understanding or perception?
Which thing?
Can thought be used as a tool for understanding or perception?
Not while you are still conditioned, because then it's a colored thought subject to your conditioning. But if you have freed yourself of all conditioning, then thought has a different quality. You do need thinking to take a decision what to do. Supposing you are the principal of a school and you have to decide what is the right thing to do. There are two different courses you can adopt. You have to decide between them what decision you should take. That will need thinking, that will need analysis, all that. That's the right use of thought. But if thought is egoistic, if thought is colored by self-interest, it's corrupt thought, and it'll come to completely different conclusions. So Krishnamurti said, the religious mind, namely the free mind, the religious mind can do all work. It's not that the work is religious or work is not religious. It can do all work. It will change the way that work is done. The religious mind can do any work. It will change the way that work is done. So it can do business. It can work in a bank. It can drive a car. It will change the way it functions in that activity, because its motivation is different.
And the second question from Kapil, is awareness part of consciousness?
It's the intrinsic quality of consciousness. When you're unconscious, you're not aware. As soon as you're conscious, you are aware. So that's the first quality of aware consciousness. For instance, you can watch a tree without thinking about it. So it's not the thought process which creates awareness. It's the capacity of your consciousness to watch what's going on, including the thought that comes up. So awareness is a separate faculty from the faculty of thinking or imagining or planning or doing analysis and so on.
And now a question from Gauss. Can awareness be encouraged, especially in children?
Yes, by letting them pay attention to what they are actually interested in and doing, instead of forcing them into what we think they should be doing. Then you are dominating over the child. That's not love. If you are watching the child, helping him to grow in whatever is natural to him, that's a completely different approach in education from directing him into a pre-formulated structure which your mind has created, that that's how you want the child to be. Then you are distorting, you are conforming, you are asking him to obey, you are fitting him into your model in your head and so on, all of which is violence.
Now we have a quick question from Connie. What was the book Professor Krishna mentioned when he spoke about the conscious, the subconscious, and the collective unconscious? And Prasad suggested it's the wholeness of life. Is that correct?
Yes, the wholeness of life is a book of Krishnamurti's dialogues with David Bohm and some other scientists.
Good, thank you.
You're welcome.
And the next question is from Hareshwar. When you said the other part of consciousness is to be aware, are you equating consciousness with mind, and are they synonymous?
You know, these words have not been precisely defined as we define terms in science. So different people use the word mind, thought, consciousness with somewhat different nuances, different meanings. But the way Krishnamurti uses, he says consciousness as we know it is its content. As we know it. He's not saying that is consciousness. But when it has this content of the conditioning, then that dominates in the consciousness. But there is always this capacity for watching, for awareness, which is the second bird. The conditioning is the first bird. The attachment to that conditioning is the ego, which feels the pain and the pleasure and bitterness and the sweetness in every experience. But the other bird is simply watching, and this capacity for watching is the innate quality of consciousness. As soon as you are conscious, you have this ability for watching and for awareness, even before thought begins. So thought is a separate thing from awareness. That's how I understand it. You don't have to take it from me. You play with it and see whether that is true.
The next question is from David Moody. The two birds in consciousness sounds like the observer and the observed. That division, according to Kay, is the source of great conflict. How are the two birds different from the observer and the observed?
When Krishna talks about the observer, he is talking about the conditioned part as the observer. And there is the second bird is the unconditioned part, just the capacity to watch. If it brings in thought, it brings in the observer. If it brings in a mission, an end in view, it brings in the observer. But there is no observer when there is no identification, no ego, no desire. There is only pure watching. Then there is no observer. The observed is the observer, is the observed. There is no separation between them. That's how I understand that statement to mean in Krishna. But don't take it from me, David. Test it out. See, my thought is different from your thought because my conditioning is different from your conditioning. But my awareness is not different from your awareness. Awareness doesn't have a structure. Thought has a structure.
So maybe I
In
will.
terms of input into the consciousness, there is the input from the senses, which is the natural input. You're looking, you're seeing what you're seeing. Then there is the input from the observer, which is the conditioned part. And that conditioning is different for different people. So that input varies. One crude example which I give in order to explain this is that the Hindu looks at a cow and sees a goddess. And the American looks at the same cow and sees beef. Each one is seeing what his content of his consciousness is telling him. But the perception is the same. They are looking at the same cow, the same object. So the truth, neither of them gets the truth so long as they are not free from the conditioning. When you're freed from the conditioning, it's possible to have observation without the observer, meaning without the interference of the observer. If you have a silent mind, you're not interfering.
So because we are nearing the end of our scheduled time, I would like to turn it over to the organizers, and I will pass on the questions from the three remaining questioners to Professor Krishna, so that Professor can answer them offline.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Krishna, sir, and Casimir, for an excellent exchange of Q&A today. Thank you all for all the questions and everything. We will see you all in approximately 24 hours. It's 1.5 hours, so to speak, for continuing this session the next session. And as Professor has mentioned, Chapter 5 and Chapter 6 will be covered tomorrow in another 24 hours from now. Thank you all. Thank you very much, sir.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Can the organizers just stay on?
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Kasmir and Rao.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to your point, Raghu, just want to ask Donna if she's going to post tomorrow's
So
meeting.
others have not left yet. Quite a few people are still on. I see Kannan still there, Ulrich still there, and Narang Saab.
I'm working on it.
Switch out. Okay, Ulrich is still there.
I'm working. Okay.
Here we are.
Okay.
You have to do each one individually to remove them. You can't, it's a little bit of a process to remove them.
So we can
Right.
go ahead and stop recording now, right?
Yeah,
Oh,
okay.
Yeah.